Hi, I'm John DeDakis, and you're one to one with me. And I'm one to one with James Hoyt. Jim Hoyt was my mentor, my professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison way back when, helped me get my first job in television. And he's got quite an impressive resume. So uh, I'll read it as fast as I can. Professor Hoyt is a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin School of Journalism and Mass Communication. He served as director of the School of Journalism from 1981 to 1991 and received his PhD from Wisconsin in 1970. He primarily taught courses in broadcast journalism and ethics. His professional experience includes time as an editor for NBC News in Washington, D.C., and other broadcast and newspaper positions. He regularly consulted for NBC News and a variety of local television stations throughout the country. The Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication has named Jim the outstanding broadcast educator in the country, and the International Radio Television Society has honored him as its Frank Stanton Fellow. In 2007, he was elected to the Wisconsin Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame, and in 2018 was awarded the Silver Circle, a Lifetime Achievement Award by the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, the organization that sponsors the Emmy Awards. Professor Hoyt has conducted extensive research on the effects of cameras in the courtroom and is co-author with the late Ed Bliss, formerly of CBS News, of the widely recognized textbook Writing News for Broadcast, which has been called the Strunk and White of broadcast news writing. Jim Hoyt, I'm out of breath. Thank you for being here. How have you been?
Oh, doing just fine. Surviving in our cocoon out here in Madison, Wisconsin, and enjoying life and enjoying having a chance to interact with former students such as John DeDakis.
Well, this is fun.
For an old guy who's just enjoying, as I said, every step along the way.
Well, I want to talk a lot about journalism because journalism has been in the crosshairs, and not just recently, because when I took your class, it was 1974. Watergate was a big deal. It was in all the papers. And I can remember all the President's Men came out about the time that I was taking some of your journalism classes. And I can remember at the time you saying something like, yeah, it's really good, but I keep asking myself, how'd you get that? How do you know that? What's your source? Because they never, because their sources had to be anonymous so that they could talk more freely, they didn't really source anybody. And of course, as we know, Deep Throat was a confidential source for like 30 years or so. So my question is, based on the track record that Woodward and Bernstein established and that Woodward continued with some of the other books that he's written, the same approach, lots of unsourced material. Do you now have more confidence that what you're reading when you read a Bernstein or a Woodward piece, that you're getting accurate information?
I would say yes. I think they clearly have established their credibility, their track record, that they do source their materials, even if it may not be identified initially. But if you have confidence in the source, then you can have confidence in the story that follows from it. And that leads me to what I think is one of the major issues that faces journalism and audiences for journalism today. I'm concerned that oftentimes people don't pay a lot of attention to the sources. They don't look to see where something came from. They're not aware who the reporters are, who did the hard work, who did the reporting, who did the editing, who did the vetting of a story. It seems to me, and this is a pet concern that I have, that for many, many audience members, if it's out there, if it's somehow in the media environment, and I happen to agree with it, or if it agrees with me, that's good enough for me. That people don't follow through as much with finding out where information came from. I know oftentimes I have conversations with people who say, I read this or I saw this, and I say, oh, who did, what's it from? Where's the reporting done? I don't know. I saw it on the internet somewhere. I saw it on Facebook. I saw it somewhere, but people are not paying attention to the sources. And to me, that makes all the difference in the world, especially in the media environment that we have today, where there is so much information out there. Some of it may be accurate, much of it may not be. But if it's out there and people are kind of inundated by it, I think it becomes much more the responsibility of the audience member to be aware of where the information is coming from.
Well, once they do that, then how do they discern whether the information is accurate or reliable? I mean, for instance, I've got friends who totally discount, let's say, the New York Times, which has been for, at least 100 years considered the newspaper of record. When reliable sources like that and the Washington Post are considered suspect, what's a person to do? How do you discern what's reliable? What standards should you use?
Well, I think the track record of the source is something that you have to rely upon. You can't yourself, as an audience member, vet everything that comes along. But if you know the expectations for the reporters, the expectations for the editors, the way the stories are handled, and if they make an attempt to see that multiple sources, multiple points of view might be covered in a story, even if you may not agree with it, I think you can respect it. And I think people need to understand that there are sources that out there that pay no attention whatsoever to trying to be balanced, trying to be fair, trying to get a variety of perspectives on them. But I think the audience members, I think they can tell if they want to.
Well, do you have any kind of a shorthand in terms of particular sources you consider to be reliable and unreliable?
Well, I mean, I only pay attention to reliable ones. Obviously.
Okay, but what are those sources that you consider to be reliable?
I think that, to me, the large major news organizations, including wire services, that I know have significant staffs and have editorial expectations for the product that their reporters are producing, are ones that I will pay attention to. My list may include the Wall Street Journal, may include the New York Times, may include the Associated Press, National Public Radio, Reuters, USA Today. I like the Gannett network does include a significant amount of solid reporting, along with some other material from their local outlets. But I think that if they have a commitment to it, if that's their business, telling the country stories about what is going on in our society and our, politically, economically, socially, medically, etc., I'm willing to read it, listen to it, and pay attention to it.
What do you mean when you say editorial expectations?
That the news enterprise, the paper, the wire service, the network, whatever it is, has standards that they set. They may be ethical standards, they may be professional standards that their stories have to meet in order to be on the air or to be put in print.
Okay. Let's say, how do you feel about such places as, let's say, Breitbart or Fox News?
I mean, I think that if I know where it came from, if I know the source, if I have it identified, if it's not just it came from somebody who's assuming that is the truth, then I might be a little bit suspect about it. However, if I can evaluate knowing the source, I don't have any problem with paying attention to it. I might not necessarily believe it. I might not act upon it. I want to put it in the context of all the other information that I have received. But I also recognize that they have an agenda that might not necessarily be covering the full breadth of the story.
There are some. I'm inviting people to provide us with questions using the chat function today, and we've already got a question from Jackie, who asks about the cognitive dissonance and echo chambers in being loyal to a specific media organization, and what impact that's having on reporting and on how people perceive of a particular the truthfulness of a message.
Well, I think there's no question. I did see a research study in the last couple months. This one did focus on people who are heavy users of Fox News, and indicated that if the vast majority, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was their exclusive source. There was no other sources that they relied on other than that. For people who relied on other networks, and including commercial networks and public networks, they relied on a wider variety of sources. It wasn't just exclusively to that. So I think there is an issue with maybe with some more than others, but if you become comfortable with, if it's, again, I'm going back to with the expectations of the audience member, if it's giving me a message that I agree with, why would I go anywhere else? Why would
exactly. It reinforces your point of view. Speaking of sources, I would love it if you would please tell your Watergate story.
Well, it was just a totally ironic situation that when I was working at the NBC News Bureau in Washington in 1972, the first day that I was all alone in the Bureau, I think I had been there for a month or a month and a half before that, but the first day that I was all alone was a Saturday in July, and I had the Bureau all to myself. I was a little bit nervous, first time that I didn't have anybody to back me up if any big story broke, but seldom did anything big happen in Washington in the summer on a presidential election year, because everybody was out on the campaign trail. The president was in California. Candidates were out and around, and there was almost guaranteed that nothing was going to be happening in Washington. So I guess it was safe to have the new guy all alone in the Bureau. So I was, and of course, what happened first thing in the morning, the phone rings, and there was a crew from our local NBC owned and operated station, WRC Channel 4 in Washington, which was down at District of Columbia Intake Court, and a story about some burglars who had been caught overnight in this office building, Watergate, so-called Watergate office building. And it appeared that there might be some connection to the president's re-election committee. And they didn't yet know exactly what was on, but they were there, had potential for getting some video. And what did I want to do with the story? So, okay, I'm the new guy. I've been there for a month. I've never
How old were you at the time?
Oh, I was 30 years old.
Okay.
And so, I took a deep breath and thought, okay, what do I do? Fortunately, I wasn't all alone, because there was another, one of the NBC correspondents was working on a program downstairs in one of the editing rooms. Carl Stern was his name. Carl had come off the White House beat and was now our Justice Department correspondent. So he happened to be in the building. So I thought, okay, I'll run down and talk to Carl. So I did, even though I was alone in the Bureau, Carl was in the building. And I went down and talked to him, and I said, I had this strange phone call from the local crew down at the intake court, and they said this, this, and this. And Carl said, oh, Nixon is in San Clemente, and John Mitchell is out there with him. He was the chairman of the committee to reelect the president. He said, I'll give him a call. I'll see what they have to say. So Carl,
wasn't Mitchell also the Attorney General at the time, or was he?
Previously was the Attorney General.
Okay. So then what happened?
So then Carl made the phone call, and I went back up to the Bureau, and I talked to the crew down at DC courts, and Carl came up and he said, don't worry about it at all. I just talked to John Mitchell out in San Clemente, and he said there's nothing to it at all. Don't worry about it. So Carl and I both looked at each other and said, okay, we're good. Just tell them to get what they can get, and away we went. And it was probably about a couple hours later, about midday, that he and I both realized that looked like there was more to this story than we had initially thought at the time. And by the end of the day, it was more. And of course, it grew for years after that. But to this day, Carl and I still communicate occasionally, and we chuckle over our intrepid instincts.
Well, but here's the thing. I mean, it's like he had a well-placed source. The point is, what good is a source if they lie to you, right?
Yeah. Well, at least he used the source. I remember doing the story that night for NBC Nightly News, and they referred to the source by name. So we had checked it out, and here's what he said. Well, obviously, there was a little bit more to that story that emerged over the years ahead. But that's my little footnote on history. Was my first morning all alone in the bureau.
Well, and so, but what's the takeaway? Because that, you were still a young person. You end up getting your PhD. You teach journalism. You've taught something like 20,000 people who are now in journalism, or at least have been exposed, to journalism. What was the takeaway from some of those in the trenches experiences, that you were able to bring to your teaching?
Verify everything. That one source is typically not going to be good enough. If you do, you identify it, and you have to have confidence in it. But I can remember one of the very first things that I learned that stood out to me in working at the bureau there. I had worked at some affiliate stations before that, and I can remember if you were putting together a story, oftentimes we would pay attention to, if we had a soundbite, how long did it go? Okay, it was 21 seconds. What's the in cue? What's the out cue? And he talked about this. And then we put it into the story. What I learned immediately at that level was, not only do you need the in cue and the out cue, we want to know what he said. What did the source say about the topic? Not just what was the topic that was discussed. So to get to the heart of what the person said and how that related to what the person's expertise was.
Right. Okay. Well, we have another question. It's, look, I don't do this all the time. And so it's not often that I get a lot of questions in real time, and this tells me that you were definitely a good get. And you're able to speak authoritatively to the situation. So this comes from Kathy, and she asks, what is your reaction to the resignation of New York Times opinion editor Bari Weiss? What do you think of the charges she leveled at her superiors, their unwillingness to tolerate opinions which diverge from left-leaning leftist ideology? I'm not sure how familiar you are with the story, but it's certainly getting a lot of play right now. I think it just happened yesterday or the day before.
I've read this. I've read a couple versions of the story, and I read her piece that she wrote. And I don't know a lot about the inside culture currently at the New York Times that serves as a backdrop to this. But I think it's an interesting issue because clearly the paper has made an attempt to try to offer a wider range of viewpoints, of perspectives, of columns, of op-ed pieces to try to add some interest to their commentary section. And whether that's tokenism, whether they really believe it, whether they're just kind of doing it a way to kind of mute another point of view. And in her charges, they kind of demeaned or discredited what she was saying. I don't know, but I think that it's an interesting issue if we have more and more media who are trying to be broader in their perspective and broader in this goes more to the opinion pieces, the editorial function than the news function. But I mean, how serious are you about it?
Well, and my question to you also is, the New York Times maintains that there's a firewall between their opinion desk and their reporting and their reporters.
Every news organization says that.
Well, my question is, do you believe that? Is that just PR, or is there truth to that?
A little bit of each. I think there is truth to it that is there. I think that the people who are writing opinion try to be independent of the news, and the people who are covering the news try to be independent of the opinion, but the publisher oversees both of them. And they all read the paper. They're all kind of aware of it. There may be some bleeding through that goes on. Personally, I'm not all that concerned about it. If I'm working for a paper, I know what the editorials are. Even if I'm a reporter, and if I'm an editorialist, I know what stories we're covering.
Yeah, but does a reporter in the back of their mind wonder, they know what the editorial slant is of their publication. Is there either a conscious or unconscious bias that they have to try to skew their stories in order to please Mr. Big or Ms. Big?
Well, I mean, that's in a way another issue. The reporters want their stories to get maximum visibility and maximum play, and want them to and want them to fit into the overall news coverage. And whether they overtly are aware of that or not, I'm not sure. But I can give you a little bit of a broadcast parallel to it, however, that I was directly involved in, and that is, at least at the time that I was at NBC, there was a financial system, a pay system that I'm not sure if it's in use anymore or not, but the reporters would get a, quote, fee. It was an additional amount in addition to their base pay for stories that made it on the air. So if I'm a reporter and I go out and I cover a story, I get my base salary. But if my story makes it onto the air on NBC Nightly News or on the Today Show, I get kind of an extra bonus. It's something that in broadcast terms goes back to when sponsors used to pay for certain talent to be on the air. But I became aware and became concerned about reporters who would cover a story, and then when they would come back to me or to the editors, they would oversell the story. They would make it sound a little bit more significant than it might really be, because they knew that would make it more likely that it would make it on the air. And if it made it on the air, they would make more money. And I thought that was a poor incentive for getting accurate reporting. And it took me a while to kind of figure out what was going on. I can remember reporters leaving at 7 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock at night to go home, and they would leave if I was on the overnight shift, they would leave their card with me, say, this is where I'm going to be tonight in case you need anybody to come in, because they stood to benefit financially if they covered a story that made it on the air.
Well, and you were a consultant to NBC, so did you speak up and say, not such a good idea?
Actually, some of those issues became involved in the way they compensated their people. And I was actually, yes, involved in doing that to a degree, arguing that if they are professionals, if you will, there's actually a definition for that, that they are at the top of their profession, that they should be paid a certain amount to do their job, regardless of how it ends up being on the air or not being on the air. Interestingly, the reporters in that case were arguing that they were not professionals, that they were just down in the trenches and they only did what somebody told them to do. They almost said, I can't write a word in my copy unless Tom Brokaw comes over and says to write it. That became kind of a reverse kind of psychology that was involved in it. But yeah.
Okay, so you've got expertise in broadcast journalism. You've certainly taught print journalists as well. Do you see a differential in terms of reliability between print and broadcast journalism?
Less now than I would say in the past, because essentially all broadcast content is archived. I used to argue that for newspapers were hard, they came out in hard copy, and you could always go back and double check and reread yesterday's paper or the day before, and you could verify, look for mistakes, and that it had more credibility in that way. Whereas broadcasting, once it went out over the air, nobody ever heard or knew anything about it anymore. And you could get by with things that you otherwise could not get by. Well, now that everything is archived, I think that at least that argument that I made at the time has disappeared.
Well, but are you seeing, well, let me ask it this way. I can remember when Nixon was president, Spiro Agnew, as vice president, was sort of his hatchet man going after the press,
Yeah.
calling them the nattering nabobs of negativism and the feet core of impudent snobs. Things have gotten a little more crass. Now it's just fake news, but the idea is still the same. But I mean, I left CNN.
Go after the messenger. Go after the messenger.
Go after the messenger.
Protect the message. Go after the messenger and try to come up with something that discredits the messenger, and it plays within certain circles.
Okay, but I mean, I was at CNN for 25 years. I left in 2013, and things have changed. I mean, things are a lot more opinionated, I guess you could say. I mean, I'm hearing anchors say stuff that I would never have let on the air, really loaded words and definitely giving their opinions. And I'm troubled by that. Are you?
Oh, I'm terribly troubled by it. Yes, yes. I mean, that's what you probably remember, it might have been the second lecture that I would say, we don't do that. But I know that it's being encouraged, not only at a network level, but even at local station level. I've talked to, in the last year, some former students who are anchors in significant markets who are being encouraged to speak out either on social media or some other forums to let people know what they think about it. Their view being, you're a reporter, people want to know what you think about it. And,
is it a ratings thing? Is it all about ratings?
Oh, I think to become provocative. You don't want to be too boring because then you don't get noticed. And I noticed,
but that's not happening in print as much, is it?
I think that the line is the sacred line, maybe not be totally sacred anymore, but is recognized more there. Part of it is because you have the geographical separation of the opinion page and the news pages.
One of the things we talked just before we went on the air that I've noticed that the New York Times, Washington Post, some of the big papers have multiple bylines now on major stories. It's not just written by the White House correspondent. It's written by, the byline is several people. Do you have any idea what's behind that?
I don't know. I've been made to have the same observation that you do. And I'm kind of curious. I suspect there's somebody who knows, and that person isn't me. But but my suspicion is that they want to cover all bases. They want to have the story be as thorough as possible. So a number of reporters are brought together to form a reporting team, and the team addresses the story and they break down the responsibilities. So they each do a part of it, and then they come together and they can kind of vet each other and, in a way, kind of edit each other's copy to come up with the overall kind of omnibus report that they do together. It, in some ways, relieves maybe some of the responsibility from the editor having to do all of that, because some of that has been done before the time. I don't know that for sure, but
haven't some of those big papers cut some of their editorial oversight to save money? Absolutely.
I mean, the levels, whereas there might have been 2 or 3 levels of editorial review, it's down to 1. And some of those mid-market papers, maybe not even that.
Another question from Jackie on the chat, saying, in her opinion, the worst part of journalism right now is celebrity journalism, which in a sense drives personality journalism. Yeah. Would you agree?
Oh, I would say I would agree with her. With the one exception is a lot of it I wouldn't call journalism. I mean, so if the term celebrity journalism, if I hear it, I would say it's celebrity entertainment. It's people trying to entertain by telling stories about the news or related to things that happen in the news. They're not really trying to tell the news. That line, it used to be a line that I would joke about and say, okay, what is broadcast news journalism, or is it show business? And I would say the answer is yes. It's a little bit of each. In order to be recognized, you have to have some elements of show business involved in it.
Now, when we were talking about reliable sources that you consider to be reliable news organizations, you mentioned, I think the only broadcast one that you mentioned was National Public Radio.
I should have included that the traditional networks. I think the nightly newscast, the half-hour nightly newscast on ABC, NBC, and CBS, I think are doing a very, very solid job. I think they are.
Would you add the PBS NewsHour?
Yes, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Include all of
Okay.
those together. I think the the early morning, the Today Show, CBS This Morning, Good Morning America, not so much.
Right.
But
That's celebrity and that's infotainment.
yeah, but I think the nightly news, they are making a legitimate effort to go back to the kind of the old-fashioned Walter Cronkite model of what happened today and give you a half-hour summary of the most important news of the day. And I think they're doing that pretty well.
Now, when I was in journalism school, there was no such thing as the internet. It was mostly for broadcast film. Videotape was just beginning to come into play, and there were no cell phones. So, I mean, news gathering was entirely different. Now we have the internet, we have cell phones. Everybody with a phone has a camera. So social media is now amazing. And you touched on this in the beginning, but I guess I want to ask you this way: is social media a blessing or a curse when it comes to journalism?
I think it changes the game significantly because rather than having 3, 4, 5, 6 sources out there for a given story, you've got 300, 400, 500 stories. And as an audience member, you have to try to sort it out. And going back to one of my earlier points about having confidence in the source, where it comes from, I think becomes all the more critical. One quick sidebar story. I can remember in Washington, there was a new technology that came out at the time where it was like an answering machine that reporters could call in and get a statement, get a pre-recorded statement from a congressman or a government official on a story that was in the news that day. And I can remember when it first came out, we just thought we were in heaven. All you have to do is call this phone number, and there you get a 20-second soundbite. You don't have to try to track the senator down somewhere. You don't have to edit it yourself. It's already been edited for you. And boy, we thought that our life was made so much easier. That lasted about one day. And then we talked ourselves out of it. And I can remember our policy was, no, we only use information on the air that we ourselves have generated. We only use the answer to a question that we have asked. And therefore, these pre-recorded sound bites from newsmakers don't pass muster in any case on that. And we immediately decided to not use them. I now compare that to a president who tweets, I don't know how many 100 times a day, and nobody asks them a question. They're not able to be verified. They have no context whatsoever, but everybody feels compelled to use them.
Well, but you know why? I mean, I've had this argument with my wife. It's like, she goes, well, why do you guys run those things? And it's like, well, it's the president. So what the president says is news by definition. And they, at some point, do have an opportunity to cross-examine him because he does make himself available sometimes, and he has a press secretary who is also asked questions. What did he mean by this? So it would seem to me that, like it or not, Twitter is his main way of communicating with people. He's an effective communicator, and it would seem to me that what the president says, whether it's with his mouth or his two thumbs, is news. Wouldn't you agree?
So I would agree, but I don't think we've done a particularly good job of putting it in context.
Okay.
To say, okay, but this compares to what so-and-so said last night, or what the president said yesterday, or this compares to the report that came out from Center for Disease Control this morning, or whatever, to provide some context to it rather than just give a blank pass.
Well, but part of it, don't you think, is because of staffing? I mean,
Oh yeah.
there are only so many people that can keep up with all of his tweets, and so there are only so many things you can cross-examine him on, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think he understands that as much as anyone else.
Okay, okay. Here's a question. Let's pivot a little bit because you've, in a sense, mentored thousands of people over the years, and I'm sure that I mean a lot of my friends are millennials, and this is just an awful time to be trying to start a career. With the pandemic, with the toxic political atmosphere, with the economy the way it is. What kind of advice do you have for people, young people who are thinking of a career in journalism?
Well, I only can answer this in the second person now because I'm not directly involved and haven't been for a while, but I do keep in touch with the people at the journalism school who are involved in it, and they say that the marketplace, it remains strong, that their placement is excellent, that the jobs are satisfying jobs that they go to, but they are not in any way traditional journalism jobs that you and I might have thought about 30 years ago. They are working for campaigns, they're working for nonprofits, they're working for corporations, they're working for national organizations, they're working for internet based enterprises, and so on, but using the same basic communication skills. And they're doing just fine. And I think that that is a real benefit to, again, I'll go back to a journalism education, is what's it all about? It's about clear, cogent expression. And that's a valued attribute, or should be a valued attribute in almost anything we do in our society. And it's paying off well, even though, as I said, they may not be the traditional journalism jobs that you and I would think about initially.
Okay. Um, in terms of covering this particular presidential election, um, how does, I mean, do you have any kind of guidance or advice or suggestions on how elections should be covered in terms of, what's legitimate news and what's just sloganeering or campaigning?
Well, I think you have to get, and I would say this in almost any campaign, any election, you have to get beyond the events. The events are almost carbon copies of each other, day after day, week after week, and have the same message being communicated. But to go to the issues and to see what their positions are and how they will actually affect people is really the heart of what a journalist can do and should do, is
Mhm.
to explain what this means, what the rhetoric, what the various phrases, catchphrases in the campaign mean, and to put it in that context, I think is absolutely essential.
Now, when I was in your class, you were in a sense a pioneer of cameras in the courtroom.
Yeah.
For the longest time, reporters were allowed into the courtroom, but just with pencil and paper. And through your influence, especially in Wisconsin, cameras were allowed in to see court proceedings. And yet, for the most part, it's not the case it's certainly not the case in federal court or in the Supreme Court. Do you see things changing there? Are you optimistic at all that things are
I,
going to
I'm,
change?
I am optimistic, but I think it may be a generational change among the justices. There have been very few, if any, issues that have come up through the state courts, the circuit courts, where virtually every state has policies that permit the use of cameras. There have been very few, if any, abuses, and I've always found it interesting that some of the strongest advocates and strongest supporters of cameras in the courtroom have been judges who have had cameras in their courtroom. They may not have welcomed them, but once they were done with the trial, their response was, "So what's the big deal? I mean, everything went just fine. It's not a big." So I think it's working its way up, and uh, there have been, I would say, probably we'll get into some of the federal appeals courts before you get to the Supreme Court. On the other hand, I would have to argue that the most interesting courts are the trial courts. I mean, they're the circuit courts where the local courts where the cases are actually being adjudicated. I've sat in as a journalist covering enough appeals courts and at least state Supreme Court to recognize that largely what we have is a bunch of lawyers reading pieces of paper at each other. And it's not very compelling television. So,
well, but this goes to the whole infotainment part of it, because wasn't one of the big resistances to cameras in the courtroom that, you know, lawyers would grandstand and it would all be show and it would diminish the gravity of the situation?
You're absolutely correct. That was almost verbatim was used to argue against it. But what happened was we had experiments in a number of states where we did it, and it proved to not be the case at all. So,
all right, but then devil's advocate, you could argue that that's how OJ got off. You know, the best, you know, the most, you know, media savvy attorneys on record.
Yeah, I don't think I can generalize from the OJ case to any other case in jurisprudence history. It's a wonderful case study in and of itself, but what was done or not done, or the type of behavior or misbehavior that occurred there, I don't think is anything that's indicative of generally the types of issues that we face with camera covered courtrooms.
Okay. Well, it's one of the things I can remember. You stood behind me at CNN when I was editing the Situation Room, and it is, I've got to tell you how intimidating it is when your professor is, you know, lurking in the background on deadline, you know, while you're trying to do something. And I can remember I made an edit. I hit, you know, I hit save, and you said, "Good catch."
Am I really intimidating, John?
Oh my God! Oh yeah. Although you have, this is my first novel, Fast Track, set in southern Wisconsin, and you already know what I'm going to do. But a lot of people have not had the benefit of this, because in this story, which is set in southern Wisconsin, my protagonist, Lark Chadwick, a 20-something young woman, has just discovered through reading a newspaper clipping that she's the miracle baby who survived a car accident that orphaned her. And so she's just discovered this. And now this scene, she is trying to convince the crusty newspaper editor, former New York Times editor, to let her do a follow-up piece on the miracle baby. So this is the scene. They're talking, and Lark goes, "I've got an idea," I said suddenly. "How about if I do an investigative piece and write a first-person article for you about what I found?" Lionel scowled. I plunged on. "A lot of people probably remember the accident and would want to know what happened to that miracle baby. You just told me how much of a failure you are as a writer." "Well, that's different. I aced the journalism class I took." "Yeah? Who was your professor?" Just as I thought. Come on, kid. You can't snow me." "Hoyt!" I almost shouted. "Professor Hoyt!" His face relaxed. "Jim Hoyt?" Lionel nodded. "Good man." That scene wrote itself.
I'm glad I'm a good man.
You are a good man. I'm having so much fun talking with you, because I'm not getting graded on this one. So at least I've reached the statute of limitations. So you can't call back my degree now.
You've made us proud. You've made us proud, sir.
Well, thank you. What was your PhD in? What did you what was the topic?
You know, it's interesting because and nothing that gained any traction whatsoever at the time.
But well, it got you tenured, right?
Yeah, I did. Well, I got me my first job.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's interesting. Now I'm thinking about it in light of our conversation that we've had in the last half hour or hour here. And it had to do with audience members, studying audience members, some of whom are more attuned to the messages of a news story that they read or hear, as opposed to the source of the news stories. That is, do they believe certain things because they came from somebody as opposed to from somebody else? Or do they believe something that somebody said because of who it was who said it? So we actually introduced or created a term that, as I said, didn't gain any traction in the social psychology literature at the time, but was called source message orientation. That is, what types of audience members, what are the other personality characteristics and attributes related to those who are more attuned to sources compared to those who are more attuned to messages. And the more I talk about these issues today, I'm intending to go back and pull it off the shelf and dust it off and see whether there might be any wisdom in there.
Oh, yeah.
Beneficial in this day and age.
Absolutely. I can remember also from the time that I was in your class, and we still see this today. Everybody is talking about the media as if it's some sort of monolith. And I can remember you drummed this into us. It's not the media, it's plural. And it's even more so today, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it covers a whole multitude of sins.
So what are you doing with your retirement now? What's life like now that you aren't in the trenches?
Life is good. Life is still in the Madison area. We living in a condominium in a nature preserve
Nice.
outside of Madison, and able to enjoy, at least up until the last 4 months, the cultural life of Madison and on the campus. And all of our family live in Wisconsin, somewhere in the southern Wisconsin area. So we are able to keep in touch with them and enjoy a good life with music, plays, athletic events, and lots of friends down here. And life is good.
Well, now you mentioned music. Are you still playing in this group?
We're on kind of on hiatus for the summer, but yes, I've been playing for the last almost 20 years now in a recreation of a Civil War band called the First Brigade Band of Wisconsin. It was an actual Wisconsin band that marched with General Sherman during the Civil War, during the end of the war, the march through Georgia and the Carolinas. And we've kind of recreated that band. We have an inventory of something like 220 instruments that all date to the Civil War. And we go to a variety of historic events mainly around the upper Midwest, although we did come out
in uniform.
Oh yes, we have our uniforms and we only play music that was written prior to 1865. And we actually were out in your neighborhood a couple of years ago. We played for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Chancellorsville.
Oh my goodness.
In Virginia.
And what instruments? What are the instruments you're using?
Well, they are it's an E-flat band, so they're mainly E-flat trumpets, tenor horns, alto horns, and tubas. I play an E-flat tuba,
who knew?
Yeah, it's been great fun to do Civil War studies as well as to play fascinating music that's 150 years old. And playing especially these instruments. So, one quick sidebar: a few years ago, the United States Marine Corps band, the president's own in Washington, was doing an event in honor of Francis Scala, who was the director of the Marine Band when Lincoln was president. So during the Civil War, and they wanted to play some authentic instruments, and the only place they could find instruments were in our band. So we had a number of members of our band came out to Washington and brought a truck full of our vintage instruments for them to rehearse on and to use and play in this Francis Scala concert, which we all thought was kind of fun.
So were you have you always been musical? Has that always been a part of your life?
Well, I took a hiatus for about 40 years. I played in high school and in college. I played in the Rose Bowl in 1963 in the University of Wisconsin marching band.
Oh my goodness!
But took time off to have a career and to have a family, and then in my retirement, I came back to. I think one of my lines when I retired was, "I'm going to renew a long dormant love affair with playing the tuba."
Nice, nice.
Here I am. I've got one back here in the corner if you'd like to hear it.
I would. Oh yeah.
I don't have one of those, though. I have a
Oh,
new, modern, up-to-date one.
oh, okay. Well, I mean, if you want to get it, I'm fine with that. Are
I'll
you?
save you. I'll
All
save
right.
you.
We'll just have to take your word for it.
You can
Let
go
me.
to you can go to the site, by the way, firstbrigadeband.org.
All right, hold on. Let me write that. This is the advantage of
Yeah.
being, one man band. I will type it in and put it on the screen.
Okay.
So what's the website?
It's with a one, a numeral one ST, First Brigade Band.
STBRIGADEBAND .org. I'm going to put it up, and then you can proofread it for me.
Okay.
All right, hold on. One stbrigadeband.org. Is that
That's our
correct?
website. And you
All
can,
right.
we've got a lot of YouTube channels that'll link you to, and you can spend your night listening to Civil War music.
All right. Now, I have one quick question before we go. And thank you for taking the time to to help put things in perspective.
Been a
But
pleasure. I enjoyed being here.
you and I have been around journalism for a long time. You longer than I. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the state of journalism going forward?
Oh, I'm optimistic. I think, to me, it all revolves around the audience caring, about the audience being concerned, about the audience wanting to find out complete stories rather than just to be reinforced. I've used the line, and I hope I can be proven wrong, that it seems to me oftentimes that audiences are not as much interested in information as they are in ammunition. So I hope we can get to the point that they can go back to being interested in information and not just for ammunition that they can use to win an argument that they happen to be involved in.
Oh, that is such a great turn of phrase, because I think we're at that point, because look, ever since I left journalism, I've had more freedom to give my opinion. In fact, my kids never knew how I voted in all the years that in the 30 or so years that they lived at home, and in the 45 years I was in journalism. And it was only after I got out of journalism and had been out for about 2 or 3 years that I began to take a risk and be a little more open on the internet about how I felt. And one of the things I discovered that goes to your point about ammunition is that all too often, and I know I fall into this trap, it's instead of talking with people, we're talking at them. It's like we're launching rhetorical artillery shells into the enemy camp, hoping that they'll explode and magically change minds. And it's not happening. And I think people are realizing that. And so I guess the point going forward is, just, you talked about it, information, accuracy, facts, that's what matters. And it's facts can inform, and if enough people are discerning, the facts and open-minded. I think if people are open-minded, that's what's going to be that make the difference in people's minds being changed.
I mean, I'm optimistic on that, but there's a long way until we get there.
Okay. Jim Hoyt, wonderful to see you again and to talk, and maybe we'll be able to do this again sometime. Thank you.
I've enjoyed it fully. Thank you, John.